Imagine, it's 1893 and the entire world is coming to Chicago for the World's Fair. The city is pulsing with innovation and optimism, and you have a new neighbor, a charming young doctor and pharmacist, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. He's ambitious, building a magnificent hotel just blocks from the fairgrounds, a true modern palace. He offers jobs, affordable rooms, and a reassuring smile. But the workers building the hotel never stay long. The architectural designs change weekly, and no one but him seems to understand the building's layout. The guests, especially young women in town for the fair, check in, but many are never seen again. You aren't living next to a visionary. You're living next to an architect of terror, in a building designed not for comfort, but for death. His hotel is not a hotel. It's a murder castle with secret rooms, soundproof walls, and a basement equipped for the unspeakable. Today, we're opening the doors that were never meant to be opened and showing you why being a neighbor to H.H. Holmes was to live next door to America's first and most terrifying murder factory. In the Chicago of the late 19th century, a city simmering with the promise of the world's Columbian Exposition, the figure of Dr. Henry Howard Holmes stood out as a beacon of modernity and success. To a neighbor, he was the personification of the American dream, a distinguished, handsome man, always impeccably dressed, whose manners were as polished as the instruments in his office. His intelligence was undeniable. He spoke with an eloquence that could both soothe a nervous patient and persuade a skeptical investor. Holmes was not just a pharmacist or a doctor. He was an entrepreneur, a visionary constructing a colossal hotel that locals nicknamed the Castle. He was known for his calculated generosity, offering jobs to newcomers and competitively priced rooms to the young women flocking to the city in search of independence. Viewed from the outside, he was a pillar of the rising Englewood community, a man building the future brick by brick. His public persona was a masterpiece of deception, carefully sculpted to inspire trust and admiration, masking the darkness that lurked behind his calculating eyes. Holmes's daily routine, observed from a neighbor's window, would have been a spectacle of unsettling normalcy. He kept hours that seemed professional but were in truth erratic and secretive. Delivery carriages and wagons arrived at odd hours, unloading peculiar building materials, large iron plates, pipes that seemed to serve no hydraulic purpose, and an industrial-sized kiln, large enough for glass-making, something utterly out of place for a hotel. The construction crews were a revolving door of faces. He would hire one group for a phase of the project, only to abruptly dismiss them, and hire another for the next, ensuring that no one but him knew the building's complete labyrinthine blueprint. But there was something stranger about the trash he disposed of. Occasionally, among the construction debris, one might notice fragments of women's clothing, or locks of hair that clearly didn't belong to any of the workmen. The sounds that emanated from the castle at night were not those of typical construction. They were muffled, metallic, sometimes punctuated by a heavy, unnatural silence. The people who entered his hotel, especially the young, beautiful women drawn by the promise of work and adventure at the World's Fair, did not always leave through the front door. Imagine a casual encounter on the street. You greet him, and he responds with a broad smile and an invitation to visit his pharmacy, or perhaps even for a tour of his hotel in progress. He offers you a tonic of his own creation, guaranteeing its efficacy. His kindness is almost irresistible, yet there is a disturbing dissonance in his presence. His smile, though perfectly executed, does not reach his eyes. His gaze is cold, analytical, as if he isn't seeing a person but rather assessing an object, measuring its value and utility. As you shake his hand, the grip is firm but devoid of any human warmth. A sense of danger, subtle and inexplicable, would crawl up your spine. A primal intuition that, despite all his respectable trappings, you are in the presence of a predator. The conversation is pleasant, yet you walk away with the distinct impression that he was reading you, learning your vulnerabilities, not for friendship, but for a purpose you cannot and do not want to understand. This psychological tension would be your first and only warning that the perfect neighbor was, in fact, a perfectly disguised monster. The 1893 World's Fair brought Chicago not just innovation and crowds, it brought H.H. Holmes a steady supply of prey. It is here that Dr. Holmes's mask doesn't just drop, it shatters, revealing the monster beneath. His emblematic crime was not a single act, but a system of industrialized murder, and the epicenter of this horror was his murder castle. This was not a hotel. It was a 3-story, 100-room death trap. Imagine a young woman, drawn by the promise of a cheap, safe room near the fair, checking in. Holmes, with his disarming charm, would lead her to one of the many windowless rooms. Once inside, the door would be locked from the outside. Through a secret peephole in the wall, he would watch her. Then, he would turn a gas valve connected to the room, and the air itself would become poison. Other victims were locked in a soundproof bank vault, left to suffocate in absolute silence. The building was a labyrinth of hallways that led nowhere, staircases that ended at walls, and trapdoors that opened directly into the basement. This basement was his private macabre laboratory, equipped with dissection tables, a crematorium, pits of quicklime, and vats of acid. It was here that he processed the bodies of his victims with the efficiency of a slaughterhouse worker, stripping the flesh from their bones to sell the skeletons to medical colleges. Holmes's modus operandi was a terrifying blend of psychological manipulation and sadistic engineering. He preyed on vulnerability. His victims were almost always young, independent women, and crucially new to the city, with no family or friends nearby to notice their immediate disappearance. He would seduce them with promises of marriage, hire them as his stenographers or secretaries, and convince them to take out life insurance policies on which he was the sole beneficiary. Financial manipulation was as central to his method as physical violence. He would defraud them of their life savings before taking their lives. His signature was not a mark left at a crime scene, but the very absence of a scene. The victims simply vanished within the walls of his castle, leaving no trace. The building itself was his weapon and his accomplice, designed to kill, conceal, and erase. He was the perfect predator, operating in an ecosystem of his own creation, a hunter whose lair was also the abattoir. The pattern was always the same: lure, isolate, rob, and eliminate, with a methodical coldness that defies human comprehension. Now connect this horror to your perspective as a neighbor. While the local news sporadically reports another missing young tourist or secretary, you notice the thick, chemical-smelling smoke billowing from the castle's chimney on starless nights, an acrid odor unlike anything from a common hearth. You hear the rumors of Holmes's fraudulent business dealings, the suspicious insurance policies, but who would believe such a charming doctor was involved in anything more sinister? Perhaps you saw one of his fiancées, like Julia Connor, a married woman who became his mistress and employee, suddenly disappear along with her young daughter. Well, Holmes would simply explain that she moved away. The brutal truth is that while you were sleeping, just a few yards away, he was dissecting her body in his basement. The muffled thud you dismissed as late-night machinery was, in fact, the sound of the trap door swinging open. The man who wished you good morning that day had, the night before, been rendering a human being into a product to be sold, an anonymous statistic in the reign of terror of America's first and most prolific documented serial killer. The terror of H.H. Holmes was not confined to the labyrinthine corridors of his castle. It seeped into the streets of Englewood, creating an ecosystem of fear and silence. The question that echoes through time is, why did no one stop him? The answer is as complex as Holmes himself. He was a master at exploiting the gaps in a police system still in its infancy. In a large and chaotic city like Chicago, communication between precincts was flawed, and records of missing persons were disorganized, especially when the victims were outsiders with no local ties. But Holmes's genius lay in his manipulation of the legal and financial systems. He was constantly embroiled in lawsuits for fraud, failed to pay his creditors, and swindled his business partners. Yet he used the courts themselves as a weapon, flooding the system with his own lawsuits, confusing the authorities, and presenting himself as the victim. He bribed officials and intimidated witnesses with a chilling subtlety. For a neighbor, reporting Holmes was not a safe option. There was no heroic detective to turn to. The local police, overwhelmed and possibly corrupt, saw Holmes as a troublesome litigant, a con man but not a mass murderer. The truth was too unthinkable to be confronted, and Holmes counted on that. The climate in the castle's neighborhood was one of a complicity forced by fear. People saw the constant deliveries at odd hours, the ever-new faces of the workmen, the young women who entered and never left. They heard the rumors of his scams and his vanished mistresses. But an unspoken rule prevailed: see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. To ask questions was to invite trouble. In an era where reputation was everything, accusing a prominent doctor and businessman without concrete proof was the path to social ruin. But the fear ran deeper than that. It was a primal fear. The neighbors could sense the anomaly that was that building, a structure that seemed to watch the street with a silent malevolence. Children were told not to go near the castle. Conversations would cease when Holmes walked by. It was a heavy silence, laden with the weight of unspoken knowledge, of suspicion no one dared to verbalize. Reporting him didn't mean the police would believe you. It meant Holmes would know you were watching him. And no one wanted to attract the cold, calculating gaze of the man whom everyone secretly suspected had the power to make people simply disappear. To live next to the castle was to live under a shadow, knowing that evil was not just nearby, but that it was your neighbor. The public perception of Holmes during the World's Fair was dangerously ambiguous, which made everything more confusing and perilous. To the press and to the fair's visitors, he was the face of Chicago's new entrepreneurship. His hotel, though still unfinished in parts, was advertised as a modern marvel. He moved in social circles, a charming and intelligent man who embodied the optimistic spirit of the White City. The media was more focused on the glories of the fair and on more visible crimes, like muggings and gang fights, than on the quiet disappearances of anonymous women. Holmes was not portrayed as a monster. Most of the time, he wasn't portrayed at all. He operated under the radar of public notoriety, which gave him the perfect cover. This duality was his greatest defense. How could the man who discussed literature and science with such brilliance be the same one operating a crematorium in his basement? The cognitive dissonance was too great. For the average neighbor, this lack of a clear public narrative about the danger he posed meant you were alone with your suspicions, isolated in your fear. The monster was not only real, he was respected. Long before the world knew the truth about the murders, H.H. Holmes's castle was already infamous in Chicago as a nest of fraud and financial scandals. Holmes was a pathological con man, and his building was the main stage for his operations. One of his most notorious scams involved the very construction of the hotel. He would purchase furniture, building materials, and even steal safes on credit from dozens of different suppliers. As soon as the items were delivered, he would refuse to pay, quickly sell the goods for cash, and then face the creditors in court with a web of lies and lawsuits, wearing them down until they gave up. The castle was therefore filled with goods stolen in broad daylight. Neighbors saw the delivery wagons arrive and, weeks later, saw the same furious creditors banging on Holmes's door, only to be met with a calm smile and a plausible denial. He turned fraud into an art form, and the constant stream of creditors and bailiffs at his door created a perfect smokescreen. To the outside observer, Holmes was a dishonest businessman, but this reputation, paradoxically, protected him from worse suspicions. No one imagined that the same safes he refused to pay for were being used to suffocate his victims. Another scandal that bubbled around the castle was that of miracle cures and pharmaceutical schemes. The pharmacy on the building's ground floor was not just a front. It was an active and fraudulent business. Holmes sold his own tonics and elixirs, many of which were useless placebos, while others contained dangerous substances. He even marketed a supposed cure for alcoholism that, in reality, cured no one, but allowed him to gather information on his clients. The most audacious of his scams was the creation of a fake company, the Warner Glass Bending Company. He set up an office in the castle, hired employees, and attempted to sell a non-existent technique for bending glass. The goal was not to create a product, but to generate a veneer of legitimacy so he could obtain massive loans and deceive investors. These financial scandals were the public face of his depravity. While the police and creditors were focused on his white-collar crimes, Holmes was committing the darkest of crimes upstairs. He used the complexity of his frauds as a labyrinth to disorient anyone who tried to investigate his activities. The most sinister of the scandals, however, was the pattern of disappearances that emanated directly from the castle. It wasn't just the young female tourists. It was his own employees and associates. Julia Connor, who managed the pharmacy's jewelry counter, and her young daughter Pearl vanished. Holmes claimed she left suddenly. Emmeline Sigrand, a beautiful stenographer he hired and became engaged to, also disappeared after her family grew suspicious of his intentions. He would tell acquaintances she had married another man and moved away. The case of the Pitezel family was perhaps the most brazen. Benjamin Pitezel was his right-hand man, an alcoholic carpenter, and an accomplice in many of his frauds. Holmes convinced him to fake his own death to collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy. The plan was to use a disfigured cadaver. Instead, Holmes actually killed Pitezel, burning him alive. Then, to silence witnesses and avoid sharing the money, he took 3 of Pitezel's 5 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, and traveled with them across several states before brutally murdering them. To the neighbors and the community, these were isolated, tragic events, explained away by Holmes's convincing lies. No one could connect the dots because the truth was too monstrous to conceive. The castle was not just a place of shady business. It was the final stop for anyone who became an inconvenience to its architect. Every empire, no matter how carefully constructed, falls because of a crack in its foundation. For H. Holmes, the fatal error was not a single slip-up, but a combination of his insatiable arrogance and the tenacity of a single man he underestimated. The life insurance fraud involving Benjamin Pitezel was the beginning of the end. After killing Pitezel and stealing the insurance money, Holmes made his most critical mistake. He failed to deceive everyone. The insurance company, Fidelity Mutual Life Association, became suspicious and hired the famed Pinkerton National Detective Agency to investigate. The investigation was led by Frank Geyer, a detective who refused to accept Holmes's lies. While Holmes traveled across the United States and Canada with the 3 Pitezel children, Geyer followed him, patiently retracing his steps. It was a relentless hunt, not for a serial killer, but for an insurance fraudster and 3 missing children. Holmes's arrogance blinded him. He believed he was too intelligent to be caught, especially for a financial crime. He continued to leave a trail of bad checks, false identities, and brazen lies, not realizing that every misstep was tightening the noose around his neck. Holmes's capture in November 1894 in Boston was surprisingly anticlimactic. Devoid of the drama he so often orchestrated, he was arrested not for the murders in Chicago, but on an outstanding warrant for horse fraud in Texas. It was his web of lesser crimes that finally ensnared him. However, it was during the interrogation and subsequent investigation that the true scale of his horror began to emerge. Detective Geyer, in a harrowing search, finally discovered the bodies of the Pitezel children. The bodies of the girls, Alice and Nellie, were found in a shallow grave in the cellar of a rented house in Toronto. The remains of young Howard were found in a stovepipe in a house in Indianapolis. With the discovery of his accomplice's children, Holmes's mask began to publicly disintegrate. The ensuing trial in Philadelphia was a media spectacle. The man who controlled every detail of his castle was now trapped in the witness box. He fired his lawyers, choosing to defend himself. A final display of his narcissistic ego. He lied, confessed, recanted his confession, and tried to manipulate the jury with the same charm he had used on his victims. But for the first time, his charisma failed. The contrast was stark. The powerful architect of evil reduced to a pathetic liar. Exposed by the overwhelming evidence of his crimes. Convicted for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, H. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. His final days were a mix of contradictory confessions and attempts to control the narrative until the very end. He confessed to 27 murders, then claimed he was innocent, and finally declared that he was physically transforming, taking on the features of the devil. On May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, the man who built his own death labyrinth met his end. He was strangely calm on the gallows. His last request was that his coffin be filled with cement and buried in an unmarked grave. An ironic plea from a man who spent his life erasing the existence of others, now terrified at the thought of his own body being desecrated and dissected by scientists. The trapdoor sprang, but his neck did not break immediately. He died slowly, strangling for over 15 minutes. An agonizing end for a man who had caused so much pain. But even with his death, did the fear he created truly disappear? What happens to the scars left by a monster who wore the face of an ordinary man? And how does a society recover upon discovering that evil wasn't lurking in the shadows, but was smiling and wishing you a good day? Living next to H.H. Holmes was a brutal lesson America was just beginning to learn. Evil rarely looks like a monster. Most of the time it smiles, offers help, and wishes you a good day, all while building a private hell right under your nose. The murder castle wasn't just a building. It was a monument to the terrifying truth that the worst abysses can hide behind the most charming eyes. Stories like this remind us that we need to look beyond appearances and question the truths we are presented with. If you are also fascinated by the darker corners of history and want to unravel other complex figures who shaped our world, join our community of truth seekers and subscribe to the channel. And speaking of men who presented one face to the world while hiding a disturbing reality, Holmes's story shows evil in its most predatory and chaotic form. But what if the evil isn't chaos but order? What if the contradiction lives not in a castle of horrors, but in the very foundations of a nation? In our next video, we will explore the life of one of America's founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, a visionary genius who wrote that all men are created equal, while contradictorily enslaving hundreds of people, including his own children. Click here to uncover the shocking duality of the man who dreamed of freedom for a nation, but denied it to his own family.